My granddaughter stopped asking to visit the cabin after Labor Day weekend. I didn't notice right away. Grandchildren drift in and out of enthusiasms, and Sophie was 8 years old, full of phases that came and went like weather in Ontario. One week it was horses, the next it was robots club. So when she stopped mentioning the cabin, I filed it away as another passing thing. It was my daughter-in-law, Renata. No, wait, I need to use a different name. Let me think clearly here, because this story deserves to be told right. I need to stop and restart without the mental noise. My granddaughter Maisie stopped asking to visit the cabin sometime after Labor Day weekend. I didn't notice right away. She was 7 years old, easily distracted, and I told myself she'd just moved on to something new. She'd been obsessed with the cabin all summer. The dock, the kayak, the frogs along the shore. Then quietly, she stopped mentioning it entirely. It was my son's wife who first said something to me. We were standing in my kitchen in Barrie, just the two of us, after Christmas dinner had wound down and the men had drifted to the living room. She was helping me wrap the leftover turkey and she said, almost as an aside, Maisie had a nightmare again last night. She keeps talking about the shed. I looked at her. What shed? She shrugged, but her shoulders were tight. Your brother's property. She says she doesn't want to go back. My brother Edmund owns a piece of land about 45 minutes north of mine. He bought it 10 years ago when he retired from teaching, 20 acres of mixed forest near Penetanguishene, a modest house, a workshop he built himself, and a storage shed at the back of the property. He's 71 now, widowed 5 years ago, and he'd always been the family's quiet anchor. The bachelor uncle who remembered every birthday, who showed up with firewood when you didn't ask, who taught Maisie how to paddle a canoe the summer she turned 5. She's probably just tired of the long drive, I said. You know how she gets in the car. My daughter-in-law, Claire, and this time I'm sure of the name, because I've said it 10,000 times in the years since, looked at me for a moment with an expression I didn't know how to read. Then she nodded and went back to wrapping the turkey. I should have asked more questions. I didn't. It was Maisie herself who told me, and she told me the way children tell you the things they've been carrying alone for too long. Sideways, almost by accident, when something else breaks open the door. It was a Saturday in late February. I'd picked her up for the afternoon so my son and Claire could have some time. We were at the kitchen table doing a puzzle, one of those impossible ones with too much sky, and Maisie was quiet in that particular way she had when something was sitting on her chest. Grandpa, she said without looking up, does Uncle Edmund ever take you to the shed? My hands went still on the puzzle piece I was holding. The shed on his property? I said carefully. She nodded, still not looking at me. No, sweetheart, he mostly uses it for his woodworking. Why? She placed a puzzle piece in the wrong spot, pushed it a little, left it. He takes me there sometimes, when Mom and Dad are inside having coffee. I set down the piece I was holding. What happens in the shed, Maisie? Her small shoulders came up toward her ears. She picked at the edge of a puzzle piece without pressing it down. He says it's our special place. He says I'm his favorite and that's why we go there and not the others. The others. I thought of my other grandchildren. Maisie's cousins, 2 boys, who had also spent time at Edmund's property. Does your mum know about the special place? I asked. I kept my voice as level as I could. I was aware of my own heartbeat. She shook her head, very small, very certain. Uncle Edmund says mums worry too much. He says if I tell, Mum will stop letting me visit and then we can't be special friends anymore. I reached across the table and put my hand over hers. Maisie, can you look at me? She did. Her eyes were so serious, so careful, the way children's eyes get when they've been taught to measure what they say. You are not in any trouble, I said, not even a little bit. But I need you to tell me, did Uncle Edmund ever touch you in a way that felt wrong? The silence lasted long enough that I started to count my own breaths. Then she pulled her hand out from under mine and put it in her lap, and she said very quietly, he said it's what special friends do. I am a retired high school principal. 31 years working with children and families. I know the language of disclosure. I have sat in rooms with social workers and police officers and parents who couldn't understand what they were hearing. I had always thought, in the distant, professional part of my brain, that I would know what to do if this ever came close to home. What I actually did was sit very still at that kitchen table, in Barrie for about 30 seconds, while the winter light came through the window, and Maisie started pressing the wrong puzzle piece down hard enough to bend it. I did not fall apart in front of her. I want to be clear about that. Whatever was happening inside me, and I can't fully describe it even now, I kept it out of my face, out of my voice, out of my hands. Okay, I said. Thank you for telling me, Maisie. That was a very brave thing to do. Are you going to tell Mum? I'm going to make sure you're safe. That's the most important thing. Can I ask you one more question? She nodded. Has this happened more than once? She looked at the puzzle. He takes me there every time we visit. We had been visiting Edmund's property for 3 years. I took Maisie home an hour later. I told Claire I needed to speak with her and my son together, and I said it in a way that made clear this was not a conversation for the kitchen doorway. We sat down at their dining room table, the three of us, while Maisie watched something in the other room, and I told them what she'd said. Claire covered her mouth with both hands. My son, my boy, who is 41 years old and a senior project manager at an engineering firm, and who I have watched handle crises that would level most people, went the color of old ash. We have to call CPS, I said. Tonight. What if she misunderstood something, my son said. Not because he believed it. I could see he didn't believe it. He said it the way people say things when they need a moment before the world changes completely. She didn't misunderstand, Claire said, very quietly. She was looking at the table. I should have. Last September, she had a nightmare. She was crying and saying she didn't want to go back to the shed, and I thought, she stopped. I thought she was talking about the garden shed at home. She's been afraid of it since she found a wasp nest. I thought that's what she meant. That's what I remember most clearly from that night. Not the phone calls, not the hours that followed, not even my own drive home through snow that had started falling somewhere around Aurelia. I remember my daughter-in-law's face when she understood that she had heard her daughter say the word and hadn't known what she was being told. None of us had known. That's the thing nobody tells you about this kind of evil. It doesn't announce itself. It hides inside the ordinary furniture of family life, and it waits. Child and Family Services arrived within 2 hours of our call. A young woman named the officer, I'll call her the officer because I don't want to name her here, sat with Maisie in a room designed to feel like a living room rather than an interview space. Soft chairs. Toys arranged carefully on a low table. A camera mounted high on the wall, nearly invisible if you didn't know to look. I waited in a hallway that smelled of institutional coffee and carpet cleaner. My son paced. Claire sat very straight in a plastic chair with her hands folded in her lap, not moving. At some point, a detective came to speak with us. He was a man in his early 50s with the manner of someone who has delivered unbearable news enough times that he's learned to do it quietly. He introduced himself and told us that Maisie was being very brave, that the forensic interviewer was very good, and that they would have more information for us soon. Based on initial disclosure, he said, we'll be moving forward with an investigation of the named individual. He paused. I want to prepare you. This process takes time. There may be things that come out over the following days and weeks that are difficult to hear. How long has this been happening? My son asked. We're still gathering information. I'd rather not speculate. My son nodded once, very precisely, and looked at the wall. That night I drove to Edmund's property alone. I want to be honest about why. It was not a rational decision. I am 64 years old, and I have been described, with some accuracy, as a measured person. I was a principal for over 3 decades. I believe in process and systems, and the importance of letting institutions do their work. I believe all of those things. But Maisie had said every time we visit, and we had been visiting Edmund for 3 years, and the drive to his property is 45 minutes, and I made it in 38. The house was dark except for a light in the back, his workshop. He keeps the same schedule he's had since retirement, up late sanding and building things in that meticulous way of his, the way he used to mark papers after supper when we were boys. I sat in my truck in his driveway for 4 minutes, watching the light, and then I got out. I did not have a plan. Looking back, I understand how dangerous that was. What I had was a lifetime of knowing this man, or thinking I did, and a granddaughter's voice saying he says it's our special place, and something moving through my chest that I can only describe as a grief so deep it had burned through to something else entirely. I knocked on the workshop door. He answered it with a piece of sandpaper in his hand and sawdust on his sweater, and he looked genuinely pleased to see me the way he always did, the way he had my entire life, and for one terrible moment, I thought maybe I have made a catastrophic mistake. Then I said, I need to ask you something about the shed. His face changed. Not dramatically, not the way faces change in films, with a sudden collapse of pretense. It was subtler than that, a kind of stillness that moved through his eyes and settled there, a recalibration happening somewhere behind them. He looked at me for a moment, and then he looked past me, through the open workshop door toward the dark yard. You should come inside, he said. I'm not coming inside. I need you to tell me what happens in that shed when you take Maisie there. The sandpaper dropped out of his hand. He didn't pick it up. James, don't. I heard my own voice, and it was very quiet and very steady in a way that had nothing to do with calm. Don't say my name. Don't tell me I'm misunderstanding something. Just tell me the truth. He looked at the ground for a long time. Long enough that the temperature of the night seemed to drop by several degrees. Long enough that I could hear the trees moving in the dark behind me. I never hurt her, he said finally. I want you to know that. It wasn't. I would never stop talking. I drove back to Barry. I called the detective and told him about the conversation. He was silent for a moment, and then he said that he needed me to come back in the morning and give a formal statement, and that in the meantime I should not contact Edmund again. Did he say anything specific? The detective asked. Anything that could be considered an admission? I thought about Edmund's face in the workshop doorway, the stillness behind his eyes, the sandpaper on the floor. He said he never hurt her, I said. And then he stopped himself from saying something else. Another silence. We'll be executing a search warrant on the property tomorrow morning. I want you to be prepared for what we might find. I was not prepared. The search of Edmund's property took 11 hours. I know this because my son called me every hour with updates, and the updates were always the same. They're still there, Dad. Still going. Until the 11th hour when he called and his voice was different. They found a filing system in a locked cabinet in the shed. Photographs and recordings on devices stored in a waterproof box, buried in a false floor beneath a workbench. Documentation going back 4 years, organized with the same meticulous care Edmund applied to everything in his life, his lesson plans, his property maintenance, his Christmas card lists. 4 years. Maisie was 7. She had first visited the property at age 3. I will not describe what was on those devices beyond saying that it was evidence of sustained, deliberate abuse of a child who called him Uncle Edmund, and who had learned by the time she was 5 years old that there were things you didn't tell your mum. Edmund was arrested at the property during the search. He didn't resist. According to the officer who called my son with the news, he'd been calm, cooperative, and had asked immediately for his lawyer. No remorse, no collapse, just that same steady, organized manner he'd had his whole life, applied now to managing his own arrest. Patricia? No. I keep sliding into the old story. There was no Patricia here. There was no accomplice this time, no one who knew and looked away. That, in some terrible way, was its own particular hell. The knowledge that Edmund had done this entirely alone, that nobody had protected Maisie because nobody had known there was anything to protect her from. He had been careful. He had been patient. He had spent decades being the kind of man people trust. The weeks that followed were the worst of my life. That's not a phrase I use lightly. I've buried a wife. I've sat with parents in my office delivering news about their children. I have had hard years, but the weeks after Edmund's arrest were a different category of difficult, the kind that changes the shape of you. My son and I stopped talking for a period of about 10 days, not because of anger, or not entirely because of anger. It was more that we each needed to exist inside our grief separately for a while, without the other one watching. He blamed himself for not noticing. I blamed myself for not noticing. We couldn't be in the same room without reflecting that blame back at each other, and neither of us could stand it. Claire was the one who held the household together during that time. She drove Maisie to the forensic psychologist twice a week. She managed the calls from family members who'd heard something was happening with Edmund and wanted explanations we couldn't give. She cooked dinner every night for a small family that sat around the table barely eating, and she did it without complaint and without appearing to need anything from any of us, which worried me more than almost anything else. Extended family fractured the way families always fracture under this kind of revelation. My older sister, Edmund's sister too, went through a stage of not believing, or of believing some modified version that didn't require her to understand who her brother actually was. She called me twice asking if I was certain, if the children might have misunderstood, if perhaps there'd been some confusion. The second time she called, I told her clearly that there was no confusion and that the evidence was documented and forensically verified, and she didn't call again for 8 months. That hurt in a way I hadn't anticipated. Watching people choose the less painful story, watching them calculate, perhaps unconsciously, whether the full truth was a cost they were willing to pay. But the cost of the full truth had already been paid. It had been paid by a little girl who carried it alone for years because she'd been taught that telling would cost her something she loved. Maisie's forensic psychologist, a woman based out of Barry who specialized in childhood trauma, told me something during one of our family check-in sessions that I've thought about almost every day since. She said that children who are abused by trusted family members often develop an elaborate internal accounting system. They keep a mental ledger of what they're protecting. The family's peace, a parent's happiness, a relationship they value. They weigh the cost of telling against the cost of silence, and because no one has told them that silence has a cost too, they keep choosing it. Maisie had been protecting us, her parents' marriage, which she'd overheard them discuss as being under strain that year, my health, which she knew had been uncertain the previous winter, my brother Edmund himself, whom she loved in the simple, unqualified way children love the people who are kind to them, who teach them to paddle canoes, who always have her favorite crackers in the cupboard. When she finally told me about the shed, she had cried afterward, not with relief, but with fear. Fear of what the telling would cost. Understanding that rearranged something in my chest permanently. The legal process moved more slowly than I could have imagined. Edmund entered a not guilty plea and retained a criminal defense lawyer out of Toronto, a woman I'd seen interviewed on CBC about other cases, good at her work in the specific terrible way that means someone capable is working hard to minimize accountability for an inexcusable act. The Crown attorney assigned to our case was methodical and patient, and occasionally infuriating in her refusal to give us timelines. But she was thorough, and she believed Maisie, and in the end those two things mattered more than anything else. There were moments during the pretrial period when I found myself doing the math on Edmund's age and the likely sentence range, and what combination of those numbers might mean he'd be released before he was too old to be a danger to anyone. I didn't let myself do that math for long. The psychologist had told me that this kind of thinking, running scenarios, trying to control outcomes I couldn't control, was a stress response, not a productive use of my energy. She was right, but knowing something intellectually and being able to act on it are sometimes a significant distance apart. The trial lasted 9 days. I attended every session except the 2 days when Maisie testified via closed-circuit video, when I was asked to wait in a different room in case my presence in the building in any way affected her. I sat in a park near the courthouse on both of those days and tried to remember how to breathe. Her testimony, which the Crown attorney described to us afterward, since we weren't permitted to watch, was consistent, detailed, and delivered in the careful, small voice of a child who had learned to tell the truth in a room full of adults she didn't know. The forensic psychologist testified about the validity of her disclosures. A digital forensics expert testified about the evidence recovered from Edmund's property. Edmund testified in his own defense. His lawyer's strategy was to suggest that the recordings were distorted by faulty memory, that the documents had been misinterpreted, that Edmund's manner with his grandniece had been misread by a child with an overactive imagination. He sat in that witness box and he said these things in the same steady, measured voice he'd used his entire life. And I watched the jury watch him and I thought, some of them are going to believe this. Some of them are going to look at this 71-year-old retired teacher with his careful posture and his quiet manner, and they're going to think surely not. They didn't believe him. The foreman read the verdict on a Thursday afternoon in October. Guilty on all counts. 4 counts of sexual exploitation, 3 counts of sexual interference, 1 count of making and possessing child sexual abuse material. Edmund sat very still. He turned once to look at his lawyer. Then he looked straight ahead, and he didn't look at any of us. At sentencing, the judge addressed him directly and at length. She said that he had spent decades cultivating the trust of a family that loved him, and that he had used that trust as a mechanism for sustained harm to a child who had no one to protect her, because everyone who loved her trusted him. She said that the presence of documentation, the methodical, organized recording of his own crimes, demonstrated not a momentary lapse of judgment, but a deliberate, ongoing choice. She sentenced him to 11 years in a federal institution with a sex offender designation that would follow him for the remainder of his life and prohibit any unsupervised contact with children upon his release. There is no version of that sentence that feels like enough. I know that rationally, in the part of my brain that understands what 11 years means for a 71-year-old man. But 11 years is not enough for what Maisie has been through, and it is not enough for what she'll carry, and no number of years ever could be. I've had to make my peace with the gap between what is possible through the legal system and what would actually constitute justice, and that peace is an uneasy one. After the sentencing, my son and I sat in my truck in the courthouse parking lot for a long time, without saying anything. The day was flat and gray, the kind of October afternoon that has no particular quality to it, no drama, just cold and dim and ordinary. I keep thinking about the canoe, my son said finally. What do you mean? When she was 5. He taught her how to paddle. She was so proud of herself. She talked about it for weeks. He stopped. I used to think that was such a good memory. Now I don't know what to do with it. I didn't have an answer for that. I still don't entirely. What I told him was that the memory of Maisie being proud of herself in the canoe was still real, that it belonged to her, that whatever Edmund had been in secret didn't reach backwards and poison every moment, even if it felt that way right now. I don't know if I believe that fully, but I think you have to say it anyway, for the sake of the people still trying to find their footing. Maisie is 10 now. She still sees the psychologist, monthly rather than weekly, which the psychologist says is a sign of real progress. She's in 4th grade and she plays ringette, and she has a best friend named, I'm not going to name her friend. Some things can stay private. She asked me once, about 8 months after the trial, whether I was sad about Edmund. We were at the park near my house, sitting on a bench, while she ate her way through a bag of those cheddar crackers she's always liked. Are you sad that he has to be in jail? She asked. I thought about it honestly. I'm sad that he made the choices he made, I said. I'm sad for the person I thought he was, who wasn't real. She considered this. His crackers were really good though, she said very seriously, the rosemary ones. I laughed. God help me, I laughed, and she laughed too, and it was the most complicated moment of relief I have ever experienced. This little girl eating crackers and finding space, somehow to hold grief and memory and hunger all at the same time. She's going to be okay. That's what the psychologist tells us, and that's what I believe most days. Not that she'll be untouched by this. She will always carry it, in ways that will shift and change as she grows. But she will build a life anyway. She is already building it. A few months ago, Maisie's school had a special guest week. Parents and grandparents came to talk about their work. I talked about being a principal, about the time 30 years ago that I helped mediate a conflict between 2 students that led to a genuine, lasting friendship. Maisie sat in the 3rd row and watched me with that particular concentrated attention she has, the same look she had doing the puzzle at my kitchen table on the February afternoon that changed everything. Afterward, walking to the car, she slipped her hand into mine. Grandpa, she said, when I grow up, I want to work with kids. What kind of work? She thought about it for half a block. The kind where you help them when something bad happened, so they don't have to feel alone. I held her hand a little tighter. There are things I wish I'd done differently. I wish I'd asked more questions the first time her mother mentioned the nightmares. I wish I'd paid attention when Maisie stopped asking to go to the property, instead of filing it away as a passing phase. I wish I had known, back when Edmund was teaching her to paddle on a lake in August, that the lake was safe and the man holding the paddle was not. But I can't carry that wishing productively. What I can do is what I've done since that February afternoon. Show up, stay steady, and make sure she knows that, no matter what any adult in her life has told her, telling the truth is never the wrong choice. If you're reading this and something is sitting in the back of your mind, something a child said that you filed away, something you thought you must have misunderstood, go back to it. Ask the question. Children don't always come to us with clear disclosures. Sometimes they test the water with one sentence, one word, one image in a painting. They are watching to see if we can hold what they're offering. You might be the person they've been waiting for. I was. I almost wasn't. Don't almost.